I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and when I was 3, I moved to Santa Barbara, California, and I'm an only child. My father owned a healthcare consulting firm, and I had a relatively normal childhood. My parents found out that I had ADD when I was 5. It was pretty debilitating. Like, I learned how to read and write a lot longer than my peers. It took me a lot longer to learn how to read and write than my peers, and my parents put me on Ritalin when I was 5 and Adderall shortly thereafter. So I was on amphetamine salts when I was in first and second grade. By the time I got into high school, I started experimenting with illicit narcotics, PG-13 drugs, marijuana, ecstasy, LSD. I got expelled from 3 high schools within the span of a month. And I spent most of my teenage years in programs for troubled adolescents. They sent me to wilderness programs. They sent me to residential treatment centers in Utah. And I had some writing published when I was a teenager. So I got into a program outside of Boston for writing. It was a writing internship program. Right away when I got out there, they would give you an $80 stipend, which was like an allowance. And I started going into the ghettos to buy heroin. I was snorting it back then. And I learned very quickly the place where I could go score it on the street. One day I went out there and the normal people that were selling it weren't around. There was a black guy out there that I'd never seen before. And I went up to him and asked him if he knew where I could get heroin. He had me follow him into an abandoned building. There were plywood for the windows. And when we got in there, we got to a stairwell. He asked me how much I wanted. I wanted $80 worth. His eyes were red. It looked like he was hopped up on something like crack or PCP. And he pulled out a gun and he accused me of being a cop. He was shaking the gun at me. It was the first time a gun had ever been pointed at me. I told him I wasn't a cop, that I was basically a college student, and that I just snorted heroin. And he told me he wanted me to shoot up in front of him to prove that I wasn't a cop. I'd never shot up in my life. I had a phobia of needles at that point. And he pulled a worn and aged syringe out of his sock. And he forced me to shoot up at gunpoint. Now, I didn't know how to do it, so he just told me to put my arm out. I looked away, and he shot me up for the first time. That was a very definitive moment for me. That was a big milestone in my life as far as, if I look back in retrospect, if I could pinpoint one moment that things started to go downhill very, very quickly, it was right when the needle was introduced. For a while, I didn't even know how to shoot up. There was no YouTube back then. You couldn't just Google how to do it. I would just stick the needle in my arm. I wouldn't even find a vein. So I had these lumps. Eventually, I learned how to do it. And I became an IV heroin addict. I got expelled from that program, and I came back to California. Abortions with different girlfriends, in and out of jail. I was homeless for a while. And I got a job brokering media for Spike TV. If you remember those shows, Wildest Moments Caught on Tape, what I would do is I would find crazy footage of like car chases or armed robberies. I would buy them non-exclusively and sell them to Spike TV. And I became an associate producer. But what happened is my drug habits started going up to a gargantuan level. No drug dealers in Santa Barbara, where I was living, could even keep up with me anymore. So I had to come down to LA to buy heroin just to sustain my habit. And I started selling drugs on a pretty major level. I was selling kilos every week. I was selling kilos of MDMA, cocaine, and eventually heroin, because the dealers that I had in Santa Barbara couldn't even keep up with me. So it got to a point where I was making about $10,000 a week from selling heroin. I would come down to East LA, and the woman that I was getting it from ended up getting caught by the feds. I didn't know that. Unbeknownst to me, she had caught in a federal case. She'd gotten caught with a kilo. And in popular culture, you see the junkie get caught and tell on the dealer. On a federal indictment, they usually have a target at the very top. So they do these big RICO or conspiracy cases. I got caught up in a conspiracy case, and she had told on about 40 people. So I had 65 co-defendants on the first indictment, I think 105 on the superseding indictment. And I came down to East LA to get my normal batch of heroin. I was getting 1 pound to 2 pounds every week. And when I met up with my connection, to a Hispanic lady, she looked at me and she said, "You're gonna be okay, mijo." And there was a tear coming out of her eye. I knew right there and then that she set me up. Grabbed the bag, went back into the car to the girl that had brought me down there, and she was sick. She was going through heroin withdrawal at the time, and she was crying. She told me that I had to get her well. I knew that we were busted, and I was trying to hurry her up, but she insisted that I shoot her up or she wasn't going to continue to drive the car. So I was giving her a shot, and she said, "Cops." And we looked, and we were completely surrounded. There's probably 40 or 50 cops surrounding the car. They had guns out. One of them kept yelling, "We're dead, we're dead." And we didn't know what that meant. DEAD was an acronym for Drug Enforcement Agency Detective. But they kept yelling, "We're dead, we're dead." I'd never seen that in movies or in TV shows. I had no idea why they kept yelling it. Later, I'd find out that that was the acronym for Drug Enforcement Agency Detective. And when I got out of the car, I had a needle in my hand. They're like, "Drop the needle." Got down on the ground, and they arrested me. That was the second time that I got caught with weight in East LA within a 48-hour period. The first time they let me go, second time they let me go again, I had no idea why. I'd never dealt with federal authorities before. I didn't cooperate with them. I thought that it was probably a search and seizure issue. I had just never heard of somebody getting arrested with drugs and being let go. I thought it was going to go away. Plus, I was making so much money at the time, I had this delusion that I was above the law. I had $250,000 cash in my safe. I thought that if it ever came to a point where I was going to court, that I had enough money to pay my way out of it. About 4 months later, I get a phone call from a blocked number. And it says that it was a guy from the DEA, and he said, "This is so-and-so from the Drug Enforcement Agency. You've been indicted. You have two charges against you. You're facing 10 to life. You can turn yourself in, or we're going to come knock your door down." So I went and I got an attorney. This guy named Bob Sanger. He was one of Michael Jackson's attorney. Spent a lot of money retaining him. And he asked me what I want. He said, "You're dealing with federal mandatory minimums. The best you're going to do is 5 years, 5 to 40 or 10 to life. I'm going to try to get you down to the 5 to 40 bracket." My girlfriend was in the car with me the first time that I'd gotten arrested. So I said, "I'll turn myself in and you can make a deal with the feds, but make sure that she doesn't get indicted by them." So he made a deal with the DEA that I was to self-surrender down in downtown LA, right here. And they weren't going to charge my girlfriend. So I came down here thinking that if I turned myself in, they were going to do my fingerprints and I was going to get out that day, maybe the next day. I didn't see the light of day for 5 years. And what they did is the feds kept their word by not charging my girlfriend federally, but they gave the case over to the state. So the same drugs that we got caught with, they gave to the Los Angeles Sheriff Department, and they charged her with it. So now she was a fugitive on the run, and I called her cell phone. Her brother picked up, and she had overdosed and died. Found out that she died because she was scared as a fugitive on the run, because the feds essentially tricked us into me turning myself in, saying that she'd have immunity, which they never charged her federally, but they gave the case over to the state. Prison, obviously I was scared. Everything that I'd ever heard about prison, violence, rape, riots, these were things that were deeply embedded into my psyche. And I remember being petrified to go to prison. I had no idea what was going to happen to me. I saw people stabbed in there. The most violent thing that I ever saw is I saw somebody pour burning hot baby oil on somebody's eye, and their eyeball came out. They had put in the microwave a thing of baby oil in a plastic cup until it got boiling hot. The guy was sitting down playing cards. The guy tapped him on the shoulder and poured this thing of boiling hot baby oil on his face, and his eyeball came out. I still have nightmares to this day of this hellacious scream. It was this wail that you never forget if you hear somebody that's endured that kind of violence in real life. Growing up in the upper middle class in Santa Barbara, violence was something that was abstracted to me. I remember when I started seeing people stabbed in real life, it looked fake. It looked like something you'd see in a movie. blood would spray out. Somebody would stab somebody and hit their artery. Blood would spray out, and you'd think that it wasn't real, but it was actually happening. And while I was in prison, I'm not an inherently violent person, so I try to stay out of the way. I decided that before I'd gotten into drugs and gotten into trouble, I was going to be a writer. So I started writing a book. And I kind of clung on to that obsession. I was going to perfect my craft while I was in there. And I was going to work every day to write a book over and over again until I had it right. And I was going to put out a novel, and this novel was going to change my life. And that is what got me through federal prison. I got out in 2013 after serving 5 years. Got my book published. It was called Wasting Talent. And it really did bring me the life that I thought it would. I started touring, I started meeting celebrities, started getting a following, and I ended up getting sober for 3 years when I got out of prison. I relapsed in 2015. And when I had relapsed, I'd been totally sober for 3 years. My life didn't have the drama associated with it when I was in active addiction. Seemed like I had everything going for me at the time. I thought I could do acid in recovery. I thought that because I was a writer, I was a creative type, I could do LSD, and it wasn't an addictive drug like heroin. Within a week, I had a needle in my arm again. My fiance had left me, and I lost everything. I lost my condo in LA. Within 1 week, I lost everything that I had. I ended up marrying a fan. I got a fan letter from a woman that lived in Denver. She said she was a big fan of my book, and she wanted to meet me. Flew her out to LA because I just sold the French rights to my book. I'd come up on a lump sum of money at the time. We knew each other for a week and we got married, had a horrible, tumultuous marriage for a year. I was doing heroin the entire time, and I was drinking 2 fists of whiskey a day. It's kind of lighting the fuse at both ends. And that culminated with me getting arrested for a DUI. I got in a car accident, but I wasn't drunk. I was actually dope sick. So the cops knew that there was something wrong with me. They charged me with driving under the influence. I beat it in the state, but since I was on federal probation, they decided to send me back to prison for 3 months. I lost everything again. Just in that 3-month period, I lost my apartment, my wife left me, I lost my vehicle. I got out and I moved back in with my parents in Santa Barbara. I was 31 years old. I didn't have a car. I was living with my parents. My book royalties were running thin at that point, and I started going to AA meetings because I wanted to better myself. I ended up meeting a girl at an AA meeting. She was like 5 years younger than me, and her and I had a platonic relationship. She told me that she just wanted to hang out with somebody that was sober. We went to the beach together one day, and she told me that she was an escort, and she asked me how I felt about it. This was not my girlfriend, so I'm a pretty non-judgmental person. I said, as long as you're safe, we're just friends. I don't care what you do for a living. She called me about a week later and asked me if I could hook her up with a sugar daddy type relationship. I was 31 years old at the time. I was like, I don't know people like that. That's probably like an older age demographic than the kind of people I hang out with. But she told me she was getting kicked out of her place and she really needed me to hook her up with somebody. Coincidentally, couple days after that, somebody asked me for heroin. I was clean at the time, but I was doing someone a favor by getting it for them. I went and I met up with my heroin dealer. He asked me if I knew any escorts. He said that he drove Uber, and one of his main clients was this guy that was in an unhappy marriage, and he wanted kind of a sugar daddy type situation with an escort. I told the girl about it because she had been getting raped, beaten on back pages. She wanted a safe arrangement. Told her about it. She asked me if I could introduce her to this guy. The drug dealer gave the guy my phone number. He called me. I set it up for her. I wasn't making any money off of it. I was just trying to put her in a better situation. And she asked me to go with her to the motel. Turned out that we got set up. There were 6 cops there, 6 sheriffs. They had shotguns in our face. The drug dealer had set us up. And they asked the girl what my role was in this situation. And she said, oh, that's my friend Ryan. He just got out of prison. I'm trying to make him money, which wasn't true. I don't know why she told them that, but because of that statement, I got charged with pimping and pandering. Now, I was on federal probation already for the conspiracy case. It turned out that the girl that I was buying heroin from back when I caught my original Fed case was connected to a drug cartel called the Mendoza Clan. Because it was such a high profile cartel case, they kept me on supervised probation for 4 years. So I was still on supervised probation for 4 years when I caught the pimping and pandering case. And they were putting a lot of pressure on me to take a conviction. A week after I caught that case, I sold the film rights to my book. A couple days after that, my current partner, who I've been with 5 years, I got pregnant. So I was out on bail, just got a film deal for my book, and my girlfriend was pregnant, and it was almost unequivocally certain that I was going to miss the birth of my first kid. My friend had written the screenplay for Fight Club, for David Fincher's Fight Club, and he told me that he really liked my life story, the chaos of it, the mayhem. He thought it would make a good documentary. So then a documentary about my life went into production. So all of these things happened at the same time. It was this confluence of a lot of really positive and a lot of really negative things. And I just had a complete mental breakdown. You know, I stopped sleeping. I'd stay up for 10 days at a time. I went into the psychosis. And eventually, I started acting so erratically. I was calling the FBI, telling them that my parole officer was trying to kill me because I honestly thought that. I got so paranoid that the feds were after me that I started having these like really public freakouts. My PO didn't know what to do, and he issued a warrant for my arrest just to try to keep me safe because they thought that I was a danger to myself or the community. And I went back to prison. I served 16 months, missed the birth of my first son. I got out 16 months later, and that last term was the worst term that I'd been in. I got in 9 riots in the course of 16 months. I got 8 stitches, 3 broken ribs. It was a nightmarish term. But the worst part of that was missing the birth of my son. You know, I'd much rather endure physical pain than have to miss the birth of another kid. That literally felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. And when I got out, I had nothing left. The documentary had been put on hold. My book sales were down. I got out and I tried to start, working conventional jobs. I went and I was working as a telemarketer. I was on welfare. It was to the point where the only way I could support my family was I was going to churches to go to food banks so I could get canned goods just to be able to feed my 1-year-old and my fiance. At the end, I was working at this telemarketing place, and my manager was probably like 4 years older than me. So I'm like 33 at this point, and he yelled at me because I didn't ask permission to smoke a cigarette. And I looked at him, and I just couldn't be talked to that way. I valued myself more than that. And I quit. I walked out of there, and I remember I called my fiance and told her that I quit. I said, I have a higher purpose in life than this. My fiance is like, we're counting on that. We're paycheck to paycheck. In fact, we're in a deficit below that. We have to have those paychecks just to keep the electricity on and to feed our kids. And I said, I just have a feeling everything's going to be okay. 10 minutes later, 2 things happened to me. The first is I got a phone call from one of my friends, and he said that someone wanted to meet me. It was a very high profile person. Gave me a lot of confidence knowing, the person presented is like an A-list actor, and this guy presented himself as a fan of my work. And the second thing was I got asked to be on a podcast. And that podcast, from just going on that one podcast and getting enough views, I was able to create my own platforms, create my own following, and I never worked for another person again. We had another kid, and somewhere in that time, I got sober for good. And now I'm sitting here sober talking to you. A lot of people ask me why they think that I went through as much as I did, considering that I come from a background without abuse, upper middle class family. My parents put me on Ritalin and Adderall when I was 5. I don't blame them for that because that was per the recommendation of healthcare professionals. This is when ADD had a rampant diagnosis. It was very pervasive in the early 90s. But what I think happened is neurologically, being put in amphetamines when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, it gave my neurology this insatiable appetite for narcotics. By the time I was 15, it seemed like when I started doing illicit drugs, it was something that I'd been missing the entire time. I don't blame my parents for that, but I would certainly ask that if there's other parents in similar situations, having healthcare professionals recommend medications, to think about it, because there might be long-term implications for those medications.
So when you were on the streets and you're heavy into your drug use, you must have seen some crazy shit, right?
Yeah, when I was 19, I had been kicked out of my parents' house, and I was on probation at the time for a drug possession. Back in that time period, if you got a dirty drug test, they'd give you 30 days. Then you get out. You get another drug test, you get 60 days. And it would go up incrementally like that, 30, 60, 90. They were trying to give me 6 months in jail. Now, I was fully addicted to heroin at this point, and I went to court for them to remand me into custody. I knew that was a possibility, that the judge might tell the bailiff, all right, we're remanding Mr. Leone into custody. And when they said that, I was sweating, and I remember just feeling the impending sense of withdrawal. I knew that I was going to be very dope sick in jail. And I just got up in court and ran out of the courtroom while the bailiff was chasing me. My parents were petrified that they were harboring a fugitive at this point, so they wouldn't let me live with them. They basically said, go turn yourself in for 6 months in jail, or you can't stay here anymore. So I basically became homeless willingly because I was too scared to go kick heroin cold turkey in jail. While I was homeless, I met this guy named Pablo. It was probably like in his early 30s, and he was a drug dealer. And he said I could live with him as long as I would be the runner for him. I'd go deliver drugs for him, give me a place to stay. He was in this tumultuous relationship with his girlfriend. They were always fighting, throwing, dishes at each other, smashing everywhere. It was a very uncomfortable place to live. So I tried to be out of that house as much as possible. One day they had me go to the needle exchange to pick up clean syringes because they sold heroin, they sold speed, and they would always give clean syringes and tourniquets, cottons, whatever, to their customers. So I go to the needle exchange. Back in that time period, it was very clandestine because it was still illegal at that point. There were some humanitarian, health advocates that would do these underground needle exchange programs. It's early 2000s. So I go get the clean needles. They give it to you in this brown lunch bag. And as I'm leaving the exchange, I see a girl that I used to know that's a stripper. She asked me if I have any heroin. She looks up at me, and through this collage of mascara, she'd been crying. I recognized her. She's pregnant at the time. She told me that being dope sick is worse for the unborn child than actually doing heroin itself. I'm dope sick too at the time. And I had a drug dealer that lived a couple blocks from there. The guy that I was living with, I would have had to take a bus an hour south. So I would have gotten something sooner if I brought this girl with me to the drug dealer's house that lived by the exchange. So I was like, yeah, we can go. It's a couple blocks away. Morally, at this point, drug addiction just completely skewed my moral compass. I don't even know if I had one at the time. I'm literally just on survival instincts, get more drugs, that's it. I'm not thinking about what it means to get a pregnant girl drugs. I'm just thinking about sustaining my own habit. We get to the house. Now I already owed the guy $60 or something. I was like, all right, let me get the money. She pulls out this yellow and blue money. I'm like, what is that? It was foreign currency. She's like, it's Korean. I'm like, he's not gonna take Korean money. And she's like, just see if, it'll convert to $100. I already owed the guy money. I knew he was gonna say no. So I go and I knock on the door. There's these Nazi skinhead guys, swastikas on their neck. And as soon as they see me, they're like, hey, do you have the $60 you owe me? I was like, I have $100 in Korean money. And they took it out of my hand and ripped it up. And they told me to get out of here. Get out of here, junkie. So I end up going back to the girl that had given me the Korean money to begin with. She's crying, hysterical. I'm like, I told you they weren't going to give me something. She's like, and she goes, well, suck their dick. Again, moral compass is skewed. I'm not thinking she's pregnant. You know, this is like even going further down on the moral compass. So I go back and I'm like, hey, okay, she'll suck your dick. And they're like, is she good looking? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, she's a stripper. I don't tell them that she's pregnant. So I bring her back, and one of the guys had just gotten out of prison. So he wanted her to give him a blowjob. So I go in with them. She goes with this other guy into this room. They kind of make a comment about her being pregnant, sitting on the couch and kind of just waiting while she's doing whatever she's doing. The guy that is inside the house is smoking meth. He asks me if I want any. I don't even want any. I'm just a heroin addict at that point. I didn't like meth. And all of a sudden, the guy runs out of the room and he's complaining, saying that, you know, she was scraping, wasn't doing a good job. And she's like, let's get out of here. And the guy that I was with that was smoking meth goes in the room where they were and realizes that some of his dope is missing. So he wants to like strip search us. And we get in this like verbal altercation. I'm like, you're not strip searching us. We're out of here. We leave. Girl pulls a few grams out of her pocket, and she's like, or out of her bra. She's like, hey, you know, I stole the dope. But I'd left the bag of needles in the house. So I tell her this. I'm like, well, you know, I left the bag of needles in the house, and at that point, there was no way we could get other needles because the needle exchange program is only open at specific hours. I had tried to break into this guy's house before. He had this window in the backyard with this stack of plywood leading up to it. It's like logs and plywood. And my friend and I had broken the latch off because we had planned on robbing this guy. So I knew theoretically I could crawl up the log pile, get into the bathroom, let myself down, crawl military style, and it was possible that I could grab the bag of needles without being seen, get back out, and we'd have the dope and the needles. There was also a very good chance that they'd figure it out, but I was willing to take that risk because I was dope sick and I wasn't thinking. So I go up this pile, I lower myself down, military style on the bathroom floor. I open the door slowly. I can see their legs dangling on the couch and I can see the bag of needles. It's like in my scope of vision. I know that I can grab it without being caught. So I crawl military style. I'm slithering to the bag, grab it. I have to do a 180 on my stomach. And all of a sudden, I hear Pink Floyd's Money. It's my ringtone on my cell phone going off right as I'm leaving. It was very quick what happened after that. But they figured out that I was in there, throw me up against a wall. One of them punched me in the face, broke my nose. So my eyes were watering. I could barely see anything. All I could see was a butterfly knife getting sliced towards me. And somehow I broke myself free before they could stab me. There's these concrete steps that go from the front door to this gravel driveway. And I jumped. And they were running right behind me and they jumped as well. And the guy dropped the knife. The guy that had the knife slipped when he jumped because I just like jumped and happened to get down onto the gravel. When he did it, he fell. Knife kind of just tumbled. So I'm looking at the knife, he's looking at the knife, and it was like whoever grabbed it first. I grabbed the knife before he did. And he's just kind of looking at me like a deer in headlights. And I stabbed him right above the kneecap because I felt I had to. I felt if I hadn't done that he was going to get me. And the girl that was with me is just standing there. She's in shock too. This guy like is literally just like, you know, there's blood coming out of above his knee. It was very, very gory, very bloody. And it seemed like everything was in slow motion. It almost seemed like the volume was down. I remember sticking the needle in. It felt like puncturing a pumpkin. It was really soft, and then it went like thud right at the bone. And I just remember what that feeling felt like. It's not what I would have pictured stabbing someone would feel like. I'd never done anything close to that violent in my life. I think I maybe had been in like a couple fist fights. It's not something I felt good about. Again, it was like more survival instinct. and I ended up getting the knife and I just threw it over the fence. Went away. I was wearing a wife beater. It was covered in blood. And instead of like getting out of that area, we went into a Taco Bell bathroom, maybe a half a block from there, and we went and shot the dope that we stole. No moral compass to be found.
What is it about drugs that change a person's moral compass? I mean, because you come from a good family, right?
Come from a good family, no violence.
You don't
no
have all the
abuse.
trauma that a lot of people I interview have had. You just got caught up in drugs and that becomes an addiction. Then your life goes haywire, right?
Yeah,
But the moral compass goes haywire as well.
Yeah, well, there's the moral compass aspect, and then there's this panic. Like if you're watching a horror movie, a lot of times in a horror film, they use the device of sound, where like when something's crescendoing, it's like, and it's like this like panic, it's like this like amplified sense of panic. That's what being dope sick feels like. So when you're in that kind of palpable anxiety where you can hear sirens going off, you're literally willing to do whatever you have to do to get out of that state of mind, because it's so terrifying. It's all encompassing, and it's almost suffocating.
Interesting. What have you learned from all of your debauchery and craziness?
I didn't learn,
because you seem very stable and level-headed right now.
I don't think I started learning until I had kids, because I think that they gave my life purpose. So before, it was like I'd been stripped down to like those primal instincts of just survival. And survival for me had been mutated to fill this drug addiction. It was like part of my survival, just as a normal human being would have to satiate hunger. I had to satiate this particular appetite. Once I had kids, I learned that it wasn't about me anymore. I was secondary, and my obligation as a human being was to provide as a parent, not just financially, but morally as well. So when you talk about a moral compass being skewed or going away entirely, once I had children, I started being conscientious of that moral compass again. And it kind of gave me direction. It was a beacon towards a moral standpoint that I wanted to achieve, to be a good example to my kids. And that's ultimately what was transformative for me. That's what finally clicked, was having to be held accountable by kids that are essentially blameless in the entire thing. I want to stop the cycle right now.
That's great to hear. Awesome. Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your story.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
That was great. Thank you.
And I think so many men are lost today. They go down these dark paths because they've isolated themselves from those types of men who'd be like, "Hey, brother, no more of that. Come here. Let's work on this together."
All right.
So.
Well, let's talk about all this. This is fascinating.
All righty.
All right. So, George, you grew up where?
So I grew up in Oregon, outside Portland, in a suburb called Beaverton. I'm the oldest of 3 children. My younger brother is 2.5 years younger than me, and then my younger sister's 5 years younger than me. So as the oldest, I had a lot of expectations on me, a lot of pressure to perform, to, live by the code and meet the family standards and everything. And, overall, my early childhood was pretty good. I have a lot of fond memories of kind of growing up as a 90s kid in the Pacific Northwest. And it was later in life, by the time I was about a teenager, let's say like 12, 13, or in that range, is when I really started to notice that our family was really intense. Arguments were always really, really intense, lots of yelling. And I was also physically very small. So I had a lot of this insecurity while a lot of my friends are growing up and having these bigger beards and, shaving and all that kind of stuff and getting muscles. I'm this very small boy still. And then couple that with all of this turmoil at home, I had a lot of insecurities, and really my kind of coping mechanism was to be very defensive about everything, because my survival mechanism that I developed was essentially, if I perceive a threat, I'm going to try and, squash it before it can hurt me. And that's what our home was like too. So, blame it on conditioning or whatever, but that was kind of the way I treated everyone. So even from a young age, I made a lot of enemies, like at school and things like that, because I was just very harsh with everything, right? And I had to win. I had to prove myself everywhere I went. It was never good enough to just be average. I had to try and be the best at everything. And so I think I made a lot of people hate me because no one really wants to hang out with someone like that. But through that, my parents' relationship really started to struggle, like to a point where I was noticing it, right? I remember one night lying in bed and they were yelling and screaming at each other. My bedroom was down the hall from their bedroom. And I remember lying in my bed, I think I was about 13 years old, hearing this yelling going on, and everything in me wanted to get up and just go tell them to stop, because I knew the other kids were hearing it too, my brother and sister. And then I remember feeling so ashamed because I didn't have the courage to do it. And so I remember feeling very emasculated, even as this, teenage boy. And then that just kind of kept swirling all of these already insecurities I had. So that was just like one vivid thing that sticks out from that to kind of highlight the type of home we were growing up in. And by the time I was 15, my mother basically kicked my dad out of the house. She accused him of being an alcoholic. In hindsight, he really wasn't. I think it was just something she could use to basically pull it over on him, right? Very manipulative. And so he did. He went to a rehab facility to, appease her. And he eventually came back afterwards. But I remember when that happened, just kind of feeling like my world had been, like my bubble had been popped, right? And because we were Christians and we went to church, and that kind of thing shouldn't happen to a Christian family. And, it's other kids who have divorced parents, not me. And so just kind of feeling all these like, whoa, what's going on here? And I'm still very small. As a freshman in high school, I was like 5 foot, 100 pounds. So not a big guy at all. A lot of my friends are already like 6 foot by this point. And so this just kept playing this narrative in my head of, I had to keep the act up. Like I'm this great dude. I've got everything taken care of. I do good at school. I do well at sports. I've been very competitive at different athletics. And I felt like I was wearing a mask everywhere I went. I basically had a double life everywhere I went. And the narrative in my head that played was, if they only knew the real you, they'd reject you. They wouldn't love you. And that really drove me in a very unhealthy way to succeed, because I was really just trying to fill this hole of insecurity. And that's where, your motivation for whatever you do is a huge factor in whether or not it's healthy, right? And so good things can be very bad. And that was definitely my outlet, was essentially using success to try and fill this hole, right? By the time I was 16, I think the week I turned 16, my parents finalized their divorce. And I don't know how it came to be, like literally, but the laws were very different back then about like parenting time and rights for fathers. And so my dad could only see us once a week, all 3 kids together in a public place for like, I think maybe 3 hours a week. And that was it. So I basically had no relationship with my dad now. And I was also led to believe that he was the cause of all of our problems. And I was very, very angry. I was a very angry 16-year-old boy. Very bitter and very much a victim. Oh, he's done this to us. This is so unfair, and just thinking about all those things, right? And in the big picture of life, my problems are still relatively insignificant, but in the context of my life, it was, the world had ended. And so then I really started externally seeking validation to kind of ease my internal pain. Again, very unhealthy. So I was always hanging out with my friends. I had a pretty good friend group. They were relatively good people. It's not like I hung out with the wrong crowd or anything. But they basically became my family because I didn't want to be at home anymore. And then I started dating this girl when I was 16. And again, that kind of became my identity. Oh, I've got this hot girlfriend. Look how awesome I am. And I even had friends tell me like, dude, you're not that special. Like, this is annoying. We're tired of hearing it. I was just very arrogant. And it was, again, just because I was so terrified of people seeing the real George that I had to like put on this persona everywhere I went. During this time too, that anger, that bitterness was just welling up within me. And that really carried forward for the next decade of my life. And I'd also been exposed to pornography when I was very young, maybe 10, 11 years old, somewhere in there. saw at a friend's house, saw the Playboy in his dad's, whatever, closet or something like that. And then, the internet, I'm of the generation where the internet kind of exploded. And I don't think my parents were even close to aware of like how easy it was to get exposed to things like we are now. And so, yeah, that was an outlet for me, was to sexually, seek that kind of gratification and validation to ease my pain. And so that became a coping mechanism as well. And that obviously did not set me up for success becoming a young man. So I had wanted to serve America and serve our country from a very young age. And I was in 7th grade when 9/11 happened. So that was a huge factor in my life, of course. And that motivation to want to kind of do something bigger than myself was very strong, very idealistic. But when I reflect on why I really wanted to be in the Army, I think a big piece of it was wanting to prove myself as a man, right? It was another thing to kind of try and fill that hole, because I'm small, I'm not this big a dude or whatever, I'm not some world star athlete or anything. So it would be a way for me to kind of prove how tough I am and I can lead men into battle and, all that kind of stuff. And then I'll be a man, right? So there was an unhealthy obsession with wanting that validation, right? It was almost an addiction to pursue that in a way that would finally like give me relief. And I applied to the Army ROTC when I was in high school, did that whole process, commissioned as an officer. I went to the University of Oregon and graduated from there, and then commissioned right after that, and then joined active duty. And so now, at this point in my life, I'm estranged from my dad. My relationship with my mother is very problematic. And the reason for that is she was very emotionally manipulative through the divorce process. So from 16 to, graduating college, it was just basically a bunch of lies that, your dad's the problem and you can't ever be like your dad. And so I was like terrified of becoming him and all this kind of stuff. And she would overshare information with me very frequently and say things like, well, because you're older than the other kids, you're more mature than the other kids, I'm going to share this with you, but it's just between us, right? And what that really is, it's clinically called emotional or covert incest. And it's when a parent, it doesn't matter the gender, but when any parent talks to a child in a way for emotional gratification in a manner that really only a husband and wife should do, or very close adult friends or like therapist to person, right? So in a way, I kind of became my mom's emotional outlet. And so she was sharing all of these details to me about my father, about their divorce, and what happened. You couple that with the addiction to pornography and then all of that, my concept on what love is completely skewed. Essentially, boundaries were completely stripped from me. And I've read a book that really dives into this form of emotional manipulation. It's called Healing the Wounded Heart by Dan Allender. And in it, he has a chapter specifically on this, and he says that they've found that the way the brain tries to protect itself is almost identical to how actual like rape victims build coping mechanisms, which I know sounds maybe a little alarming because they're very different forms of, struggle. And I'm not equating my experience to victims of sexual assault, but the way the brain reacts is almost identical. And so I had these very unhealthy coping mechanisms going into adulthood and seeking, a wife one day and things like that. And that really played out in my marriage. So back to graduating and joining the Army, I was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division as a field artillery officer. I showed up, and very quickly we were ready to deploy to Afghanistan in 2012. And it was a very intense environment, which I thrived in because of my upbringing, rise to the challenge and expect the most of yourself. And so I actually did pretty well. My deployment was actually a very good experience for me. And I know that may sound weird to a lot of people. I didn't see any like insane combat, right? No one's going to write a story about my combat experiences, but I saw enough to kind of understand how fortunate we are in America, right? I saw the ugly side of life. I saw what evil looks like. What a human can do to another human. And so it makes you very appreciative of, in many ways, how comfortable we are in America. I had met my wife before I deployed. We started dating, and she wanted to stay in a relationship while I deployed. And so we basically did our relationship in reverse while I was gone for 9 months. We had enough internet to like send Facebook messages to each other, emails and stuff. And so we basically talked about all the things that would typically end a relationship. And we were in alignment on a lot of that. So when I returned home, we were, these kids in love. It was this fairy tale story, the soldier returning from war and has the girl. And I proposed to her very quickly, and we got married shortly after that. And at this point in my life, I thought maybe I had escaped it all, right? Maybe I actually am a man now. I'm a combat veteran. I'd earned respect from these men that I really looked up to. A lot of them had deployed 3-4 times when they went with me, and I'd earned my place among them. So I thought maybe, you know what? Maybe I've done it. Maybe I am a man now. And I got the girl, and I've got the dream job I've always wanted. And so for a while, things were pretty good. And in reality, looking back at it, I think I had just deceived myself. I had not continued, I hadn't even really started to do any of the actual work I needed to do on me, to not be seeking external validation and to actually be confident and secure in who I was first, and then do these things because it's the right thing to do. My motivations were still completely flip-flopped and twisted. I was still addicted to porn. The way that I expected sex with my wife was like an addict, right? It was just this very unhealthy way to have a marriage, quite frankly. The way a husband and wife should desire each other was not what I was providing my wife. It was very unhealthy, driven again by that kind of twisted sense of love and boundaries and things like that. And we eventually decided to start our family because it was likely I was not going to deploy. I wanted to make the Army a career. So there's pockets of kind of the way a flow of a military career can go where you have some downtime, and we're like, well, this would be a great time to, to start popping out kids and live that dream. And we both wanted to be parents. And so we were excited. Things were really good. And then the birth was very, very difficult. My wife was in labor with our daughter for a very long time. I forget how many hours, but it was a lot, like 48 hours, something very, very long. They had to do an emergency C-section. My wife hemorrhaged. It was very scary. And now she was at a point where, her body is physically broken now. And here we have our daughter. And my wife had very, very severe postpartum depression. And I was so emotionally crippled that I basically reacted like this is something she was doing to me, not something she's suffering from. And in reality, a real good man in that situation would have provided a covering and protection for his wife and found solutions to help her and would have endured some unfair things for her sake, right? Because this is your family. This is the woman you've made a covenant commitment to. And instead, I basically lashed out like 16-year-old angry George, mad at the world, and treated her like she was the cause of my problems now. So I used that to justify all my behaviors. The details of what she struggled with is her story to tell, but where I will describe is my response to what happened. So things were very bad. There were, visits in the hospital and things like that. And I basically just went off the deep end from here. I became extremely selfish, very self-serving, and, this is so unfair. She's not the mother that she needs to be, and I've got my career in the Army, and there's no way I can keep this up, and just very, very, very selfish. But we got to a point where the pornography wasn't enough for me anymore. So I was chatting with women online and all this kinds of stuff, and essentially committing adultery virtually. And she caught me while I was still on active duty, and our daughter is like maybe 3 months old, right? And the fact that is what I've done is very shameful. I hate that I have to say that, but the only way forward is in full transparency. And I downplayed it. Oh, I'll change. I'll never do it again. All the things an addict would say. That's exactly what I did. And from this point, then I was like, we have massive problems. We need real help. We went to a place called Onsite in Tennessee. It's a very intense therapeutic experience. You go in as a couple with a bunch of other couples in small groups, and you spend 8 to 10 hours a day together in intense experiential therapy. And this was the first time in my life where I really started to recognize maybe my childhood wasn't so good. And it was a little bit helpful, but it was almost like I had created so much damage already in the marriage. I had so many things I needed to work on that it felt a little bit like too little too late almost, right? So then the only option I felt I had available to me was to leave active duty, to have more time, make more money, all that kind of stuff. So for those who aren't aware, the active duty lifestyle demands a lot of not just the service member, but of the family. You're gone a lot. Even when you're not at war, you're training and they send you all over the place. It's very long hours. The pay isn't the best in the world, comparatively to what the civilian sector can provide. And I thought that would be good for us because it'll allow us to stay in one place, make more money, have more time to do therapy and things like that, and to try and heal. But what really happened then is the one thing that was grounding me and giving me some semblance of identity was now gone like that. And our relationship was just coming to a head here. And we moved to Texas, took a job with a tech company, and this is 2016. And we moved down there, and about 2 weeks later, we had this massive fight, and I basically told my wife to get the fuck out. I think I said that exactly. And so she did. She moved back to Tennessee to live with her mom, and our daughter was with her. And then I just was like, well, I'm going to take care of number one. I just became this pathetic, selfish version of myself and acted like a teenage boy. I'm just going to care about myself, and I don't care about anyone else, and that's their problem. And so I was hanging out with all the people who would tell me what I wanted to hear, not what I needed to hear. And I was drinking all the time, and eventually started cheating on my wife. So we're separated, but we're still married at this point, and I'm cheating on her. And then I had a lawyer on retainer to divorce her. And we finally, I had a moment of letting my anger subside for a second, and we had a conversation about, well, I think we need to try and make the marriage survive. This is, we have a daughter now. And so we did. She moved back home eventually. I forget how long. It was like 3 or 4 months. We were separated, and then she came home. And from here, we tried to work on the marriage, right? And the problem, whatever her faults were, is essentially irrelevant, because the problem was I was still not taking any ownership of my faults. I wasn't actually fixing the things George had wrong. And part of that was just lack of awareness. So I was still living this double life. I was deceiving her, and eventually got to the point where the turmoil inside me was so strong, and I was so tired of living this double life. I had no way out, really. And so I told our therapist that what I had been doing, and I said, I don't even know what to do. And so she got me signed back up to go to on-site for myself individually. And they were doing like a special veteran and first responder cohort. So everyone there was, military or police or fire, something like that. And when I got there, I was still playing the game. I still had all these masks, because if they only knew the real you, they wouldn't accept you. And it got to the point where part of the process is you have to tell your story, like I'm doing right now with you, and you have to lay it all out there to heal. And when it came to be my turn, I was so afraid to be honest. I was more scared in that moment than I was for my first combat patrol in Afghanistan. The nerves inside me, the physical stress of having to tell the truth felt more terrifying than being shot at, And but I did. I told the truth, and I expected nothing but judgment and wrath from these other people, many of whom had been very honest with their faults already. And instead of getting condemnation, I received grace and understanding. And so that was like the first kind of like rock thrown at my walls that kind of started to chip it away of maybe honesty and courageous transparency is the only way forward. So that kind of started the healing process, at least within myself. And the other thing that happened while I was there, and I think this is 2017, the other thing that happened was I realized that I needed to let my anger and hatred towards my dad go, because I was just drinking poison and expecting it to hurt someone else. And so they had a labyrinth that we walked, and you were supposed to take a rock and it represented whatever you wanted it to, and you're supposed to leave it in the middle. And it may sound a little silly that it was just this little gesture, but for me, it legitimately felt like I expelled all of this anger out of my body. I felt like a wave of peace come over me walking out of that labyrinth, even though I knew I'm gonna have to go now confess to my wife, right? So I had maybe the next scary moment of my life right ahead of me, but I felt much more whole in that moment. And I felt a lot of empathy for my dad, because what I also realized in that moment was he's just a man too, with his own flaws and struggles, and he missed us too. This happened to him too. It's not like he is this abuser or something. He's part of the, he's been wounded by this whole situation as well. And that was really healing for me to kind of see him through a different perspective. And so my therapist gave me a strategy for how to confess to my wife. There is like a clinical way to do what's called full disclosure after cases of infidelity. And that was actually the scariest moment of my life, was looking my wife in the eye, the woman that I had committed to wed and to love and care for in sickness and in health, for better, for poorer, for better, for worse. And I had to confess to her face to face that I have essentially committed the ultimate betrayal repeatedly. And I was certain that she was going to leave me. I believed in my heart that I wouldn't stay for me. Why would she? And she was hurt and angry, obviously. But she was willing to try and work towards reconciliation. And so at that moment, it felt kind of like just a slight little hope, but it was hope. And our therapist had a joint session with us also, and she recommended we read this book together or listen to it on an audiobook version together called Silently Seduced. And that book basically outlines what emotional incest is and how it manifests. It typically happens to men most, the behaviors in men. And it gave my wife kind of the understanding of what I was struggling with. And it helped her kind of have a little bit more understanding of, not excusing my behaviors, but understanding why I've been doing what I was doing. And so this was still, I think, 2017. And eventually then, we started the healing process, and I was starting to take ownership for myself, but we had a long road ahead of us. We were still just a bunch of hurt kids. I was like 28 at the time, 27. And a friend I had met from on-site, he was a Marine veteran. He called me up, just checking in. Hey, how you doing since we met each other at the place? And said, honestly, not too good, man. Like, you know my story now, and it's hard, and I don't really know what to do next, quite frankly. And he said, there's another place you need to check out. And that was Mighty Oaks Warrior Programs. They have a location here in California. And so, I got signed up for that. I showed up, and it's a week-long experience. It's for veterans and first responders, founded by veterans and first responders. And that really was the point where I actually started to heal me inside, and blaming my wife wasn't an option anymore, right? Blaming anyone else wasn't an option anymore. And the reason was, when I was there, there was all these men in my group who had seen very troubling things in their various combat deployments from all different branches of the military. And I looked up to a lot of them, and they were vulnerable. They were honest about their experiences and what they were struggling with. And so I realized that maybe men actually are honest. Maybe men aren't just playing this game, because a real man should actually be comfortable enough to say who he is. And I also witnessed something that made me realize that I had isolated myself from everything I needed in my life to be the force to basically put boundaries on me, to force me to be a better person. A member in my group, he was wounded by an IED. So he could walk for like 10 steps at a time. He basically lived in a wheelchair. And so he had his legs, but they were like not functional. And he was describing his struggles as a dad with his teenage children. And well, because I'm in this chair, I can't do this. And because of this, I can't do that. And the group leader interrupted him and said, "You're using your combat injury as an excuse to be a bad father." And I was like, whoa, there is nowhere in America, this is 2018, nowhere in the country is someone looking at a combat wounded veteran and saying that to them. And I was like, uh-oh. He stormed out, he left, and he came back about 30 minutes later and he said, "You know what? You're right." And when that happened, I realized for me, I've been doing that. I've been using all of my excuses to not improve myself. So that was a very powerful moment for me to stop playing the game and actually just be a better person. And at the end of that, I prayed to God and said, Lord, I know better. I've professed to be a Christian my whole life. I've read the Bible and all that. And I've obviously not been actually following what I profess to believe in. And I was essentially trying to rely on my own strength, my own understanding, my own ability to just willpower my way through life and be the best guy. And so I surrendered in that moment. I prayed, Lord, just you're in charge. I have tried myself. It has obviously not worked. And so I'm, I guess, very hard-headed and stubborn and learned the hard way on this. But that was the moment where I first started to surrender to him and put him in charge of my life. And I actually sought real accountability then. So what I learned through this is I need other men around me who may not be perfect. They're not maybe the best men in the world, but they're trying their best to actually be better. And that was a very powerful moment for me because spiritually, mentally, and kind of like socially, I had finally put the right conditions in place to actually heal. And I think this is where most men struggle today is they don't have those factors in alignment. And so they'll go do acts to heal. Oh, I went to therapy, or I went to this, or I did that. But it's just like a behavior. It's not actually changing you from within. And so again, it's like expecting this square peg to fit in a round hole. It's not going to happen. We still had a long road ahead of us from there, but my wife and I started to improve, and I slowly, very slowly, should have been a lot faster, started to have more things like emotional intelligence and patience and understanding and empathy and compassion instead of just treating my wife in that same survival response where, oh, if she's in any state of unrest, she's doing it to me and I need to lash out and squash it before it hurts me. That was essentially our cycle. I just kept that going. And at any point I could have stopped it. And to that point, that man in the wheelchair, we checked in at one point and we had a big fight, my wife and I was definitely a huge cause of that fight. And he's listening to me. He heard me out for 5 or 10 minutes and then he interrupts me and says, "Brother, you could literally get out of your house. I've seen you. You're fit. You could literally outrun your wife if you had to. If you needed to just stop this argument and stop the damage, you could literally just get outside and go away for a little bit. I can't do that." And I was like, oh, dang. You're right about that. So it was the poke in the chest I needed to again, bring me back to reality and not letting me believe my own delusions. And we do this as humans. We try to justify our behaviors because it's easier and it feels better in the short term than having to say, I am the problem. So fast forward to today, my wife and I have now been married 11 years. Our marriage is at a state that I never thought we'd be able to reach. It's a testament to her willingness to continue to fight for our marriage. And I say that intentionally, fight for your marriage. It's something that people need to take seriously. It's the most important commitment you've ever made in your life. And so to throw it away is very disastrous because it doesn't just hurt you, it hurts your children. And then by extension, that carries out into society. And I mean, we can throw up the statistics on the screen if you want. I mean, it's insane. A family without a father or with both parents, what the likelihood of those children having issues, whether it's with the law or drugs or something, is just astronomically high. So it's worth fighting for more than just yourself. And we've battled. We've battled together to fight for that. And I'm glossing over a lot of things that have happened for the sake of time, but I have to credit my wife for giving me a lot of grace and forgiveness that I definitely did not deserve. And in the same way, I've had to forgive her on things and have patience and grace too. And that's what marriage is. It's grace. Real love is having grace. And as recent as last year, about a year ago from today, I was actually sitting across the table with a man named Nick Lavery. interviewing him for my podcast, and he was talking about the importance of emotional regulation. And he had no idea that this is exactly what George needed to hear. He was just using it as a great talking point to drive his point home. And in that moment, it like pierced me to my heart across the table, because just 2 weeks prior, I had yelled at my wife. We had this huge argument. It was Christmas night. I had ruined Christmas because my anger was in the driver's seat. And in that moment, in the studio with him, I'm just like collapsing internally, being like, oh man, I've got a lot of work to do still. And I realized that the most dangerous thing to my family is not someone kicking in the door and robbing us or mugging them on the street or something. Those could happen, but very small likelihood. The biggest threat statistically for my wife, the highest probability, is me losing my temper. And that was a very hard to swallow pill, but I've dwelled on that heavily in the past year and have really worked on having emotional regulation. And so this dovetails into where I think most men are lacking today. We weren't taught that to be a strong, courageous man, to be a warrior, doesn't mean you're a brute. It means you have a great deal of emotional intelligence, because stoicism is not the absence of emotion, it's control over emotion. And so I think a lot of guys have deceived themselves thinking that, well, I don't get overly emotional, but really what they're doing is they're just detaching and becoming like a robot. Well, eventually that wells up within you because you're a human being and you have an emotional state. You can't ever escape it, and they blow up. And that was me. I was just trying to push it all down, and you can't. You're going to lose the war eventually, and it's like a volcano, it erupts. So I started to really learn that you need things like strength and leadership and courage and discipline, but you also need grace, empathy, compassion, understanding, patience, emotional regulation. You need to have something happen to you, slow yourself down, whatever your coping mechanism is, whatever your survival skill is from whatever happened to you. You have to get back in the driver's seat, put your little self away. Hey, little George, adult George is here. I can handle this now. And then respond from a position of wisdom as opposed to just lashing out. So that's been a very healing journey for me. And that's a big reason why our marriage has changed, because this is another fundamental truth I believe we've strayed away from in society, is that in general, and I'm speaking in generalities here, men act and women respond. Women are responsive creatures. So in the context of a marriage, the responsibility, the burden is on the husband. It's on the man to take ownership of himself and start living properly, the disciplines and accountability and all the things he needs to be a better husband. And it sets the conditions for his wife to become better anyway, right? Maybe she is at fault, but you can still be better. And if you do, it forces her to gravitate towards you and your children as well. You're setting the example for them. So we've gotten into this cycle where we play the blame game, and all we're doing is just shooting each other back and forth. And so you're just eroding trust, you're eroding safety, and especially in that emotional side of the house. Logically, she's wrong. Yes, brother, I hear you. But emotionally, you're now creating this rift between you. You're making her fearful and anxious. What do you expect to get in return? Whereas you could diffuse that, even if it is unfair, and set that safety for her to recognize, oh, well, he is a strong man in control, and my emotions can't actually throw him off course. He's still a man on a mission. That makes her feel safer. She may be mad in the temporary situation, but over time, it actually makes her feel more at peace. And so this is something I had to learn way too late in life, right? As a 33, 34-year-old man, when I should have probably learned this as a teenage boy, right? For how to actually be this tender warrior, kind of both halves of the equation there. So to really drive what a man should be, I think this is the point of my story, isn't to like feel sympathy for me or something, but it's to use my example and extract in your own life how you can apply this today. And so there's 4 pillars of authentic manhood, and every man needs to understand these. And I will say this too, like every man has different strengths and weaknesses. So it's not like you're all the same, but these elements must exist within you to be a good man. You want to be a better husband? You need all of these in balance. And so if you think of like the Greek structure where it's got the pillars and the roof on top, well, if any of those are missing, the whole thing's going to collapse. The first pillar is king, and the second is warrior, mentor, and friend. So you need all these things in alignment. And so very quickly, the king pillar is leadership. Men are built for leadership. You look at your marriage, you are responsible for your marriage. You chose to marry this woman. Maybe she is at fault. Maybe she has flaws. Maybe your kids do this and that. So what are you going to do about it, man? You going to blame them and attack them, or are you going to take ownership of the outcomes and actually change the situation? And so real quickly, within leadership, there's the 3 legs of leadership. And I learned this from my mentor, John Michael Clark. If you think of like a stool, a tripod, right? All 3 have to be there or the thing collapses. It's authority, responsibility, and compassion. You have to have the authority to actually make the situation change, right? So the president has to have authority to make, orders for America. In the same way, you have to actually be in a position of authority to change any outcomes. You have to be responsible. You have to own the outcomes. Fault is irrelevant. It's I'm owning the outcomes, and I will take actions to provide better solutions next time, regardless of who's at fault. And then the last one is compassion. And that is your people, you love your people a lot, and they know it, and you show it. And I think these 3 legs apply across the board. It's not just in the context of marriage. I think this applies in the military, right? I think compassion has a place in the military. I was a much better company commander now that I had learned some of these things and had become a father and had some time to kind of relax and have emotional intelligence to use wisdom in decisions and not just being this hard charging, harsh, leader. So those 3 legs are essential. And men find purpose when they actually step up and start making decisions in a way that helps others, right? There's something that we need within us as men to be in some form of leadership. Now, at a minimum, it's yourself. You need to lead yourself and start being better for yourself, and then by extension, your families. And maybe some of you are fortunate enough to have a position at work or you're in the military or something where you're a leader. That's the first pillar. The second one is the warrior pillar. This one is first and foremost, you should be physically in control of your body. You should be capable of violence, right? We talked about Jordan Peterson saying you should become a monster and then learn to control it. I agree. You should be able to protect your family, but you should also be able to do a lot more than that. A real warrior is not just a physical brute. He is also strong morally and emotionally and spiritually. And so what I mean by that is, where are the threats really coming from today? For the dads listening to this, for your children, what's the number one threat they probably face? It's probably not a violent person on the street. It's probably something they see on TV or the internet or something like that. So where are you to stand in the gap and defend them? Are you vigilant? Are you watching out for where the danger really is? Or are you just going about your life and, well, it's fine. It's a kid's show. It's okay anyway. Did you check? Because what are you exposing them to? So this is where a lot of men, I think, have failed for generations. Oh, well, that's child's play. I don't need to worry about that. I just need to provide and protect and put food on the table and keep going around. Well, where were all the men to stand up at school boards and say, yeah, these books shouldn't be in school, or this shouldn't be happening, or we don't agree with this in our society? And this, I'm not trying to get political, but whatever you believe in, you should stand up for it and say, no, I disagree with this. We're not going to tolerate that. That's not hatred. That's not anger. That's called protecting the innocent. And so men are really at their best when they defend the innocent. We use all of our strength, our power, our leadership for the sake of others. It's not self-serving. And that's really a key distinction. I talked earlier about how your motivation for doing something really determines whether or not it's good or bad. The thing itself is almost neutral. It's why you're doing it. So you should be using your skills as a man to defend the innocent. The next one is the mentor pillar. And this one's pretty straightforward. It's just men love to train others, and we love to learn skills ourselves. And so if you're not doing that for yourself on a consistent basis, you start to feel empty. You start to feel kind of depleted. And it's also one of the biggest gifts we can bring to the table as men. If you see someone who's actually trying to get better and you have the skill set to help them overcome that hurdle, that is the most rewarding experience you can have. I reflect back on my time in the military. My personal achievements really aren't that important to me. Whatever, right? My favorite moments that just pop out in my head vividly are the times where it was someone I helped reach a new height, get promoted, or get to a new school or whatever, have their own success through my leadership, through my training of them. And if men would do that more freely and more willingly today, first with your family and then with your friends and society, I think we'd have a much different America today. And so that, critics will try and attack and say, oh, you're mansplaining. Well, exactly. They're trying to keep you isolated so that you can't actually change the problem. Because if they can just get you out of the game before it even starts, the problem never gets fixed. I think there's a lot of that going around today. So men should have the courage to stand up and actually give of themselves to help others reach new heights. And then the last pillar is the most important, and it's love. It's friend and lover. Everything you do, that motivation is out of love for other people. It's not for selfish gain, right? So I kind of love to use Andrew Tate as an example. He says a lot of good things in many regards. Oh, work hard, do these things, right? It's that red pill mentality. It sounds good on the surface, but why is he doing all that stuff? It's to take care of number one. I want more cars. I want more women. I want more whatever. It's all selfish gain. That's not actually alpha male. That's teenage boy. That's what teenage George did in his brokenness. It's not manly. So a real man understands that he tempers everything he does in all situations with love and understanding, empathy, emotional regulation. And if you look at that, regardless of what role you fill in your life, love is kind of that catalyst that makes all of these other pillars more effective, right? As a military commander, I was more effective by having emotional regulation, being in control, not letting my temper make decisions for 130 soldiers, right? Instead, making logical, wise decisions based off of understanding. As a husband, slowing myself down, not letting my anger burst out, being more calm with my wife, having that space to hear her out and then find a solution together on the same team as opposed to at each other. Same thing with your children. It applies to all four of those pillars. So this is a huge understanding I think is lacking in the modern American man. And it's something I had to learn the hard way. And so I'm hoping that just this awareness helps others today kind of reflect on themselves and think, where am I lacking in some of these areas, right? I think guys typically kind of fall one way or the other, where you're the king and the warrior, but you have no love. And so you're just this tyrant. Or you fall to the other end of the spectrum where you're kind of just the pushover. You're the nice guy, right? Well, I don't make anyone upset. Yeah, but a lot of times politeness is not kindness. Like, do you discipline your children? If my daughter had her way, she'd eat ice cream for every meal. I say no to her, not because I hate her and don't want her to be happy, but because she doesn't understand that to be healthy and to not be sick all the time, she needs to eat actual food, and every now and then we'll have some ice cream. So that doesn't make me hateful. And you can apply that exact mentality to every situation in life. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I had to learn that has definitely played out in making me have a better life. And I'm hoping that other men today will take ownership of those things.
Beautiful.
I don't know how much longer you want to go, but
no, that's awesome. So it's such a refreshing talk for my channel. George, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
Hopefully a lot of men will listen to this.
I hope so.
Thank you very much. Even though Soft White Underbelly consists of a lot of videos, it's really still a photography project to me. And if you appreciate the photography, sometimes it's difficult to enjoy it when it's scrolling down the screen, which is the only option I had in this horizontal format on YouTube. So last year we came out with the first Soft White Underbelly book, which is a collection of the best portraits from the thousands of interviews I've done. Each portrait in this book is accompanied by an interesting quote.